From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted.
The Master of the Sarah Emma. Some years ago I stayed on a night in a hotel close to the North Road Station, Plymouth. Among the few guests there was a gentleman named Grant. He got to know of my interest in the supernatural, and seeking me out, told me the following story, which he said was his one experience with the unknown, and one he had not felt able to relate to anyone at length before, for fear of skepticism. Yet all the facts of the story could be verified. Grant said it happened in Liverpool when he was a boy. He was living with an uncle in Duke Street, and his chief delight at the time was wandering about the docks looking at the ship. One day a young friend of his came along in great glee to say that his dad had bought an old ship lying in one of the small docks for timber. The men had not yet started demolishing her, and if they went to look her over, one of the men would row them across to the vessel. The two boys went off at once. They learned that the ship, a small brig, had not been to sea for more than 20 years. She had been built at the beginning of the last century and employed for the greater part of her career in the fruit trade with Barcelona and other eastern Spanish seaports. As they were rowed out towards her, they had never seen a more dreary or dilapidated-looking hulk. Once on board her, there was little to see, only a couple of bare masts and a wheel and an equally forlorn-looking deck-house. Yards, canvas ropes were all absent. The spirit of adventure, however, was on both boys, and making their way rather gingerly over the slippery deck to the main hatchway, they descended the companion ladder to the passage leading to the cabin and forecastle. They found the whole place swimming in water, while occasional loud splashes and quick scampering announced the presence of rats. They had finished exploring all they dared, and were retracing their steps along the passage leading to the companion ladder, when Grant's friend suddenly gasped with surprise and gripped him by the arm, asking sharply, "Whatever was that?" Grant looked up, and there before them, in the act of coming down the ladder, was a tall man clad in the sort of costume sailors used to wear in the early part of the 19th century. The light from above deck, falling directly on his face, threw it into strong relief. It was that of a middle-aged man, with very pronounced features, black curly hair, beard, and whiskers, though his cheeks were absolutely colorless. He came slowly and leisurely down and advanced straight towards the two boys. As he drew near, they instinctively shrank against the wall. He did not seem to notice them, however, but walking on past them, still with the same slow, leisurely tread, he entered one of the cabins they had just explored. Grant's friend, looking very pale and scared, caught hold of Grant's arm and half dragged him up the companion ladder and onto the deck. "Did you notice anything peculiar about that man apart from his clothes?" he said, as they stood waiting for the boat which was to bring them to shore. "I thought it odd that he never once looked at us," Grant replied. "That's true," his friend observed, "but there was something else besides. His feet made no sound. He walked absolutely noiselessly." "What do you think, then?" Grant said, an uncomfortable feeling stealing over him. "What do I think?" whispered the other boy, casting a terrified glance in the direction of the companion hatchway. "I don't think at all. I'm certain what we saw was no man at all, but a ghost. This old hulk is haunted." The rowboat could not arrive too soon for them. The day after the strange adventure, Grant's friend came running to see him in a rare state of excitement. "What I told you yesterday," he said, "is perfectly true. That old hulk is haunted, and if you will come with me to the man who sold it to my dad, he will tell us all about it." Grant went with him to a house close to the Victoria Dock where this man lived. He was a very old man, near 90, but he still retained that kind of breeziness which long association with the sea almost invariably breeds. The boys then learned from him that he had in fact once sailed in the old ship. He had served his apprenticeship aboard her. He was not at all surprised to hear about the ghost, and in a clear, steady voice, told his story to the boys, which I put down in his own words as Grant described them to me. It was a hot, sultry night in the summer of 1825, the old man began. I had been at sea then just over 2 years, and we were lying at anchor in a small bay a little to the south of Barcelona. The captain and the first mate had gone ashore early in the morning to arrange for a cargo of fruit being shipped on board the following day. When I went below deck at the end of the second dog watch, they had not returned, and speculations were rife as to what could have detained them so long. There was another apprentice on board, and we shared a small cabin next to the captain's. Well, it didn't take me long to slip off my clothes and tumble into my bunk, for I was very tired, and in a few minutes I was fast asleep. I awoke with a start, to hear in the distance a wild, prolonged scream. It seemed to come from the shore. There was something so harrowing about it that the blood in my veins froze. I sat up and called out, "Jack! Did you hear that?" "Yes," my companion, whose name was Jack Weston, he is still alive and director of a big shipping firm, replied. "I did. It was probably someone being done in by one of those criminals on the docks. Murders are as plentiful as blackberries in and around Barcelona, you know. I wonder if the old man and Masters," he was the first mate, "are back yet." "I wonder too," I said, and lying down again I tried to go to sleep. It was a vain effort, however. My thoughts kept going back to that cry, and I became full of a strong sense of foreboding. Could it have anything to do with our captain? I got up and going to the porthole looked out. The night was superb. Overhead an ultramarine sky, a full silvery moon and myriads of bright stars. Below and on either side perfectly calm water, glittering and shining like the scales on a fish's back, while in front was a long strip of silver sand bordered by the dark forms of gently nodding firs and beeches, with away in the far distance the dark outlines of heavily wooded mountains. It was the sort of thing one sees in picture postcards and seems too good to be true. Well, I stood and gazed at the scene for a long time, and all the while I could hear nothing but the lap-lap of the water against the ship's sides, and the creaking and groaning of the idle rudder. Finally, the impulse seizing me to go on deck, I yielded to it and left the cabin as noiselessly as possible. I was in the act of ascending the companion ladder when Captain Gale, that was the name of our skipper, suddenly appeared at the head of the steps and began to descend. "What did the captain look like?" Grant timidly interrupted to ask the old man. "What was Captain Gale like? Why, he was a tall man with rather marked features and black hair, beard, and whiskers. On this day, however, he looked ghastly pale. He came down, and when he was close to me, I touched my cap and said, 'Good evening, sir. I was about to add something else, but he did not give me time. While apparently seeing me, he walked past and went straight into his cabin, slamming the door to behind him. I can hear that slam now. Thinking this rather odd, but supposing he was vexed about something, I went on deck, and going up to the second mate, who was on duty, I said, 'I see the captain's back.' The mate stared at me. 'What do you mean?' he said. 'The captain's back,' I repeated. 'When did he come aboard?' The mate's face hardened. 'He hasn't come aboard,' he growled. 'Are you trying to have me on?' 'No, mister,' I said, and I explained to him how I had just met the captain on the companion ladder. I never saw a man look queerer. Plainly wondering what I was up to, he stuck out that neither the captain nor the first mate had returned yet, and it ended in our going below deck and knocking on the captain's cabin. There was no reply. We knocked again, and as there was still no response, we opened the door and looked. Not a sign of the captain was to be seen anywhere. 'You've been fooling me,' the second mate said grimly, and I could see I was for it if I continued to argue. So I went back to my cabin while he resumed duty on deck. Next morning there was still no sign of the 2 missing officers, and in the end we were obliged to return to Liverpool without them. Their fate was an absolute mystery. The ship, however, was haunted. A ghostly figure, the exact counterpart of Captain Gale, was constantly seen descending the companion ladder and going into the captain's cabin. The crew, in consequence, were much demoralized, and on our reaching port, they left in a body. That was how the Sarah Emma first got the reputation for being haunted. "The Sarah Emma?" Grant exclaimed. "You can't see any name on her now?" "I suppose not," said the old man. "She hadn't had a coat of paint on her for 25 years, but that was the name by which she was known when first I sailed in her. She subsequently changed it not once but many times, and all owing to the ghost. Although I stuck to the Sarah Emma, I didn't go to that part of Spain again for several years, not indeed until I was second mate. It then so happened that we came to an anchorage one day in the same bay, and pretty well the same spot, and as there was every prospect of our remaining there for some time, I obtained leave to spend a day or two ashore. When I landed, I had no idea where to go or what to do, but after wandering about for some time, I eventually decided to penetrate inland and see a little of the scenery that had so captivated me from the ship. After strolling along for some distance, I came to a spot where several paths met, and was debating which of them to take when I suddenly saw before me a figure that seemed strangely familiar. It was that of a tall man in sailor's rig. As his back was towards me, I could not see his face, but from his general appearance I gathered that he was English. Cheered at the sight of a fellow countryman, I followed him, and in a few minutes arrived in sight of a small inn. He went right up to the front door of it, and then halting, turned slowly around and looked at me. To my amazement, it was Captain Gale, and what clinched matters was that he smiled at me. Before I could do or say anything, however, he had turned the handle of the door and entered the building. Trembling all over with excitement, I at once approached the door and knocked. No one came at first, but on my knocking again, a woman emerged, and in broken English inquired what I wanted. I told her a night's lodging, adding that I had just seen an old friend of mine into the house. "An old friend of yours?" she replied. "That is impossible. There is no friend of yours here. There is no one in the house at all but myself." I told her that she was mistaken, that I was quite positive Captain Gale was in the building, as I had just seen him pass through the doorway. She looked a little uneasy, I fancied, at the mention of Captain Gale, but she still emphatically denied there was anyone in the house saving herself. Seeing it was useless to argue, I changed the subject, and asked her to let me have the best room she could, and ordered a meal. Well, nothing of any moment happened till the night. I had gone to my room, but not liking the appearance of the bed, which was a huge four-poster, made use of an armchair instead. I had been in it for perhaps an hour or so, trying to sleep, when I heard footsteps very softly approach my door, and after an interval of several minutes, during which I felt someone was listening, the bed gave a loud creak. I at once looked at it, and in the moonlight saw to my horror the big canopy on the top slowly commencing to descend. It did not, however, get far, for more footsteps came along the passage outside, and it at once stopped. There was then an altercation carried on in low voices, a sudden scuffle, a sharp cry of pain, and a loud thud. Leaping to my feet, I rushed to the door and threw it open. Lying on the floor outside was a man whom I recognized at once. It was Masters, the first mate of the Sarah Emma, the man who had so mysteriously disappeared along with the captain several years before. He recognized me too, and bidding me kneel down and listen, he made an extraordinary confession. Masters said that he and Captain Gale had come to that house, that they had both had the room that had been given to me, that Captain Gale had been murdered, and that he owed his preservation to the fact that, not liking the appearance of the bed, he had slept in consequence on the floor. He said he was so infuriated with the murderess that he would have killed her offhand had she not gone on her knees and implored pity. This moved him, so he had spared her, and in the end she inveigled him into staying with her, and they married. He declared he had been very unhappy, however, as she had the most ungovernable and cruel temper. He said he often had to be away from the house for nights together, and he had on more than one occasion suspected her of enticing people into the inn during his absence and murdering them. He said on this particular night, returning unexpectedly, He had surprised her in the act, and on his remonstrating with her, she had stabbed him. This was Master's tale, and when he had finished it I carried him at his request into the parlour downstairs, and then left him. Hurrying to the shore, I got into a boat and rowed right away to the Sarah Emma. Nothing was done that night, but in the morning the captain, myself, and several others of the crew rowed into Barcelona and reported the matter to the British consul there. He at once communicated with the local police, with the result that about a dozen of them accompanied us to the inn, only to find it deserted. The wounded man and the woman had both disappeared, and what subsequently became of them I was never able to find out. As for the Sarah Emma, she still continued to be haunted by the ghost of Captain Gale, and from what you boys have told me, she still is. So ended the old seaman's story in this account told me by Mr. Grant at the Plymouth Hotel, a strangely involved tale which he assured me could be verified from many sources, including his boyhood friend in Liverpool, descendants of the old man who had heard the same story from his lips, and more particularly from the actual records of the ill-starred Sarah Emma, and from others who had sailed in her. The Pool of Horrors. There is no pool of water in England which has been the scene of more suicides and murders, and consequently which is more sinister in reputation, than that known as the Suicide Pool in Epping Forest. Among the many weird things that are said to occur at this pool every now and then is the ghostly rehearsal of any impending tragedy, and it was a rumour such as this that prompted me to spend the night by the pool. When I arrived at the scene of my vigil, the rich autumn moonlight gilded the surface of the water, where in places it was free from the shadows of the neighbouring trees. If only those trees could speak, I thought, what dark secrets they could tell. I was thinking then of the mystery concerning Emma Morgan, a pretty young servant who was last seen alive walking through Woodford, Essex, in the direction of Epping Forest with the baby in her arms. Emma had been in the service of a wealthy Tottenham tradesman, who had dismissed her because, although a married woman, she had encouraged numerous lovers, and by one of them had had the child. Being homeless, for her husband would not take her back, no inquiries were made about her, and probably never would have been, had not her body and that of the child been found, not strange to say, in the pool, but close to it. Both Emma and her baby had been most horribly murdered, and their fiendish assailant was never brought to book. I thought of this and other tragedies as I stood on the edge of the pool, peering into its dark still water and listening to the rustling of the wind through the half-naked branches of the neighbouring trees. Every now and then a dog from afar howled, and a night bird wailed, and once from close behind me came a noise like a cough that I swung round, fully expecting to see someone, but although in the moonlight everything around me stood out clearly and distinctly, no one was to be seen. Soon after this I heard a faint feeble cry like that of a child in pain. Again I swung round, and again I saw nothing. Then from a distance came the sound of a strange tramping, the steady march of a host of people. On and on towards the pool came this tramping, solemn and in step, but although I heard it distinctly, I could see no one. Then, within a few feet of me, the tramping suddenly ceased, and I visualized very clearly a number of black-robed figures standing with bowed heads, supporting in their midst the coffin, and apparently waiting for something to happen. A noise from near at hand made me look round, and though I still saw no physical presence, my mental vision brought to me the image of a young man with a white, evil face. He was dressed in a grey suit, and he was bending over the body of a woman. Picking up the body, he came staggering with it to the pool, and threw the body into the still gleaming water. For some seconds he stood scowling at the body as it floated on the surface. Then, muttering angrily to himself, he walked away. Directly he was out of sight, I again heard the slow, measured tramping, and sensed that the procession of black-robed figures had moved on. I waited till all was silent again, and then came away. The experience of the night was so vivid and puzzling that I described it to an old inhabitant of Epping. In my description of the woman he was particularly interested, and told me that, according to newspaper cuttings, he had my account of her tallied exactly with that of a woman who who had been murdered and thrown into the pool by an unknown person in the summer of 1887. The same man then told me of a strange experience of his own. He said that early one morning, shortly before the First World War, when taking a walk in the neighborhood of the suicide pool, he had been horrified to see the body of a man lying face downwards in a ditch, and standing by it a stout, stockily built, shabbily dressed man with a gun. He was still more horrified when, just as he was about to approach and question the man, both he and the body in the ditch disappeared. The incident, however, was more or less explained, he thought, by the fact that 2 days later the body of an ex-NCO was actually found lying face downward in the same ditch. The circumstances plainly pointed to murder, but no one was ever apprehended, and the man's death remains one of the many unsolved mysteries of Epping Forest. The Staircase and the Pit. An old friend of mine, a doctor, bought himself a practice within almost a stone's throw of Camberwell Green, in southeast London. On more than one occasion afterwards, when I saw him, he seemed disturbed about something, and finally, one day, it was in the early 1920s, he decided to unburden himself and tell me the following story, imploring me to keep it to myself at that time, because it wouldn't do for me to let it get mooted abroad that I believed in ghosts, a doctor's commonly thought to be above such weaknesses. One night, he began, soon after I came into tenancy here, I was ascending the stairs to the first floor which you, O'Donnell, came up just now to the drawing-room. It was late, for I had been studying, and the clock in the hall pointed to 1:30. I had almost arrived at the top of the first flight. I was, in fact, on the 7th stair, when suddenly I felt myself slip. The stairs somehow seemed to disappear from beneath my feet, and in their stead I was acutely conscious of a terrible funnel-shaped hole, of hideous darkness and the most prodigious depths. I appeared to be on the very brink of it. An inch or two more and I must inevitably go sliding down a steep incline, which ended abruptly in the most frightful pit. In an agony of terror I clutched the banister, and as I did so I distinctly felt a current of cold, clammy air fan my nostrils. I called out, and on my housekeeper coming out of her room with a lighted candle, the sensation ceased. The staircase at once became normal again, and I was able to continue my ascent. I explained my conduct by saying I had been seized with vertigo, and my housekeeper at once fetched brandy. "You are like a sheet," she said. "I have never seen you look so ill before," and she made me swallow half a tumbler of my visitor's best. The following day it was her turn to give me an alarm. I had just come back from a long round of visits when I heard a thud, as I thought, in the hall. I ran out of my study to see what it was, and found the housekeeper lying on the mat at the foot of the staircase in a dead faint. When she had recovered sufficiently, she told me what had happened. "I was coming down the stairs," she said, "when I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. 'Annie,' I called out, thinking it was the maid, but there was no reply. I called again, but still there was no answer. I then became conscious of a cold, horrible smell like that of a charnel house. It blew past me down the stairs and seemed to fill the whole house. At the same time, the steps caught me up, and someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around and saw the face of a skeleton peering at me from under a big black hood. Then I fainted. And that, my friend," the doctor continued, "was all my housekeeper was able to tell me. She was so badly shaken, what with the fright and the tumble, she fell down at least 4 stairs, that I kept her in bed 2 or 3 days, and then sent her for a change of air to Bognor. After that nothing of any note happened for some time, maybe a month. The 2 servants were the next to have an experience. They, the cook and housemaid, were sitting in the kitchen one evening when I was out playing patience. Something had gone wrong with the gas, and they had to have candles. Not content with 2, the cook lit 3, whereupon the housemaid rebuked her, remarking that to have 3 candles burning at the same time was a sure way of courting disaster, since it invariably attracted something evil. 'Why, look there,' she said, pointing at one of the candles. 'See, there is a winding sheet already, and it is pointing in your direction.' The cook turned pale. 'What does that mean, Annie?' she exclaimed, staring at the candle as if fascinated. 'It means—' Annie began, but she did not finish, for at that instant there was a loud noise from somewhere overhead, as though a great weight had suddenly been dropped on the floor. 'Lord have mercy on us!' the cook cried. 'Whatever can that be?' 'Let's go and look,' the housemaid replied. 'It sounded like a pile of books. It can't be the master's bookcase, surely.' 'It didn't sound to me like that,' the cook answered. What did it sound like then? Annie said. Why, the cook replied with a shudder, it was more the sound of a big box or a coffin. They bravely took a candle each, and having searched the ground floor, were going up the hall stairs when a sudden gust of wind blew both candles out and left them in the dark. They then heard a number of footsteps like a procession of people and bare feet coming down the stairs from the very top of the house, cross the landing and begin to descend the stairway at which they stood. They told me they saw nothing, but were conscious of countless presences passing close to them, and of a smell like to nothing saving the smell of a newly opened grave. When I returned home soon afterwards, I found them still standing on the stairs, too petrified with terror to move hand or feet. I relit their candles, and we made a thorough tour of the house, but there were no signs of any ghostly visitors, and nothing, as far as I could see, had been disturbed in any of the rooms. However, the two women that night both gave notice to leave. You might wonder, my friend said, why I did not then decide to clear out myself. Well, I hadn't the time. The practice kept me much too busy. Besides, there was nowhere else for me to go. Unfurnished houses of the type I needed were practically unobtainable in this district. After the cook and housemaid left, I invited two friends to do a sitting here, and they brought an alleged medium with them. The medium started seeing things at once, but they did not correspond in the slightest degree with any of the phenomena that any of us had experienced. She told me that the spirit of someone who had been murdered in this house about 100 years ago had appeared to her, and that after conversing with her it had promised it would never come again, and that there would be no more disturbances. For the next 2 or 3 days nothing did happen, but on the 4th day I again had an experience. As before, it was on the stairs. This time, however, it was in broad daylight. I was coming down to breakfast, and had reached the 2nd stair of the 2nd flight leading from the landing to the hall. That would be the 7th stair of the 1st flight going up, when I suddenly felt myself slipping. Just as before, in an agony of mind, I caught hold of the banisters, and was conscious of the same dreadful funnel-shaped pit yawning to receive me. More than that, something seemed to rise up out of it and clutch hold of me. It did not feel altogether like an arm, but more like a tentacle, cold, clammy, and pulpy. I tried to shake it off, but without avail. It clung to me all the tighter, and had I not gripped the banisters with a strength born of despair, I must have been dragged down the sloping brink of the pit into the black horror beyond. The struggle seemed to go on for an eternity, and all the while I was fighting the thing, with a sweat pouring from my face and every other part of my body. I was conscious of a variety of trifling happenings in the hall and house. I heard, for example, someone rap at the back door, and the housekeeper answer and say, "No, we don't want any stationery. We have already bought 6 packets. Don't come again." Then there was a slight pause, interrupted by a rattle of fire irons, after which the milkman ran up the steps and dumped down his can by the front door. A dog in the road started barking. They were common enough sounds, and I had heard them all many times before, but now they appeared to be endowed with the most endearing properties, and to form a highly essential part of my life. I cannot describe to you all I endured, and it would be impossible for you to realize it without having had a similar experience yourself. To see everything that indicated life, the life with which I was so familiar, all around me, and then to be dragged away from it all and hurled down into that awful yawning pit. I struggled frantically against the grip of the tentacle, but to my unspeakable alarm it gradually forced me to relinquish my hold. Finger after finger lost its hold on the banisters, until at last only one remained there. It was the middle finger of the right hand. I shall always feel a particular affection for it, and it had more strength and tenacity in it that morning than all the other fingers put together. But at last this also gave way, and the banisters began to recede from me. "I do not think, O'Donnell," the doctor said, "any lost soul could have suffered more than I did then. I am not exaggerating, but it was also horribly realistic. The staircase, I tell you, was no longer beneath me. Nothing was beneath me but the slippery, sloping brink of that awful black hole, and as I commenced sliding towards it, I saw certain of its horrors with the most damning distinctness. Its sides were composed of black rock, with here and there deep, vein-like fissures and growths of what appeared to be monstrous fungi. As I slid further down, the shadow from the brink fell all around me like some nightmarish pall. and the interior of the house with all its familiar objects was at once obliterated. I tried to shut my eyes to hide the vision, but I could not. Some all-compelling force forced me to keep them open. Nearer and nearer the precipitous sides of the pit drew, until at last I arrived on the very edge. I made a strenuous effort to keep my foothold, to dig my heels into the hard, slippery soil, but the tentacle-like arm that still held me urged me on, and I finally plunged forward into space. The next thing I was conscious of was a voice which I did not recognize at first, asking me if anything was the matter. I stared around me, and instead of the black, frowning horrors of the pit, I saw the bright walls of the house and the worried face of the housekeeper. I had taken the plunge after all, but was still standing on the stairs, holding onto the banisters like grim death. Here the doctor paused, and I asked an obvious question. "No, it was not a dream," he replied. "How could it have been, at that hour and in that place? Some people might say it was merely an impression, but to me it was an experience awful in its intensity. The next time I went up the stairs happened to be late that night, and I took care to avoid treading on the 7th stair. Nothing happened. In the morning, when I came down to breakfast, I again avoided that particular stair, and nothing again happened. So, said I to myself, the secret of the pit phenomenon, at any rate, lies in the 7th stair, and that being so, I will have it up. I did so, but could discover nothing that in any way explained the mystery. Several weeks then passed without anything of moment occurring, and then came the unexpected. An aunt of mine suddenly took it into her head to pay me a visit. She came on a Saturday, and I quite forgot to warn her about the staircase. While I was sitting in my consulting room on the Sunday morning, I was poring over a case that was causing me considerable anxiety. My aunt burst in with a face white as chalk. "What on earth's the matter, Aunt?" I said. "Are you ill?" "No," she gasped, sinking into a chair and half closing her eyes. "I have just had a fright. You never told me this house was haunted." "Haunted?" I exclaimed, trying to look astonished. "Why, you don't mean to tell me you believe in ghosts?" "I didn't a short while ago," she said very seriously, "but I do now. Listen. After you had breakfast, you left me in the dining room, didn't you? Well, I sat there for a few minutes, reading the Bible, and then I went into the hall with the intention of going to my room to dress for church. Your staircase is steep, John, and I have to mount it slowly. When I came to the last stair, but one in the first flight—" "The 7th stair?" I interrupted her. "Yes," she replied. "I suppose it would be about the 7th stair. I ran against something." "Against something?" "Yes," she said, undeterred. "I collided with what felt like a living person standing on the stair. It gave me such a start that I turned round and ran downstairs again, and on reaching the bottom I looked up. Although I did not actually see anything, I got a very vivid impression that a man was standing there on the 7th stair. He was quite 6 feet in height, with red hair and a very white face. He was staring not at me, but at something directly beneath him, and there was," here my aunt shivered violently, "a very great terror in his eyes. He seemed to be on the stairs for several minutes. I was too fascinated to move, and then he vanished quite suddenly." That, O'Donnell, my friend the doctor said, was my aunt's story, but there is a sequel to it. Some days after she had left me, I received a caller, who introduced himself as Mr. K., brother of a former tenant. "I took the liberty of calling on you," Mr. K. said, "owing to a rumor I heard to the effect that this house was haunted. My brother was an early tenant here. The house had only recently been built when he came to it. He is now a very old man, and there was, as far as I know, nothing wrong with it then. I told Mr. K. your theory, O'Donnell, that new houses may be just as badly haunted as old ones, because all sorts of things may have happened in the past on the side of the house, and he agreed, adding, however, that from what he had been able to gather, the side of the house had no particular history. He then told me something which greatly interested me. He said that when he called on his brother in this house one morning, he found him on the stairs in the hall reading a letter he had just received from China. It was from a friend there, and contained news of the death of Charles, his brother's only son, a youngster of barely 20. He was a victim of plague and had been buried in a huge pit just outside the town where he had been living. My brother was absolutely devoted to Charles, Mr. K. told me, and from that hour he was never the same. He began having delusions and imagining he saw before him the most terrible pit, full of frightful things. Finally he became so bad we had to have him put under care, and he is still in an asylum." I asked Mr. K what his brother was like, and he replied, "He is a tall man, and despite his extreme age, his hair is still red, very red." I later, on some medical pretext, visited the place where this old man was confined and spoke to him, but could extract nothing from him, only some incoherent mutterings about his son. After my visit, however, all the trouble in this house ceased. O'Donnell, that's the whole case. Do you think it's possible that the hauntings were due to the workings of this poor demented man's brain? That his thoughts actually took shape here? Or was it all a coincidence, and the phenomenon experienced on the staircase owed its origin to some much more remote cause? I could not then give my doctor friend a satisfactory answer to his questions, and not even now, in the light of later experience, do I feel able confidently to give an explanation for the strange affair and the sudden end to the hauntings. Many cases do remain a puzzle, and this is one of them.